There's something unsettling about seeing ourselves in the mirror. Throughout history, across cultures, and in scores of horror films, the reflected world can be a portal into the unknown. But what happens when these mirror selves take on a life of their own? Today, we're delving into a few strange and eerie accounts of doppelgängers. Welcome to Shadowland, everybody.
Welcome.
This is a podcast that shines a spotlight on stories of the supernatural, mysterious, eerie, and unexplained. Stuff like dark matter,
Auras,
answered prayers,
angels,
prophecies,
sentience in plants,
UFO hotspots,
cryptids,
NDEs,
stargates,
remote viewing,
sprites,
telepathy,
sex cults,
all that stuff.
all that stuff and more.
Yeah, so Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy
Welcome
New Year.
to 2020.
Yeah. First episode of 2020.
We're back.
Whole new year.
Yes,
Whole new set of things to talk about.
absolutely.
Topics
And you've
to
got
get
something,
into.
right, and just real quickly, I have to say congratulations because you have something very new.
That's right. That's right. A new
You have a
baby.
shadow baby.
That's right. Shadow baby. Just on the planet. Just arrived on planet Earth. So, yes.
Oh, so that's so awesome. Congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah, and it's a crazy year, off to a crazy start so far. And I was just thinking about, there's obviously a lot of deaths that have happened too. And I was just also thinking about, I guess it was 2019, but Ram Dass also just passed away. And I don't know if you know who Baba Ram Dass is, but it's
I don't, but you should totally do him on an episode.
yeah, I think we will. He was like an American spiritual leader, sort of tangentially connected to the psychedelic movement and all that stuff. But yeah, he passed right at December 22nd or something like that. So shout out from Shadowland, Ram Dass's spirit out there looking down on all of us. So cool. So, but today, what are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about doppelgängers.
Yes, doppelgängers. So
I wanted to do this one for a while, so I'm pretty excited about it.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it turned out to be a little different than I thought it'd be, but I think we have a few different stories we're gonna jump into here. So
Yeah, maybe we should just start things off by kind of just giving an overview for people who don't know what a doppelganger is. And I mean, the word gets bandied about a lot. I know, there's this whole thing on social media of people finding their doppelgangers, which is basically somebody who looks so much like them it's uncanny. But originally, the word doppelganger is German for double walker or double goer. And it's basically this idea of a mysterious actual double of a living person, not a twin, but an actual duplicate that you would encounter.
Yep. Yeah, and I read a few different. There's I guess there's some lore around them. There's other sort of parallel versions of doppelgangers or sort of phenomena like a doppelganger in other cultures that have different names and different sort of stories behind them. Some people believe we're actually seen into a parallel universe. In some cultures in Scotland, I guess, they have these small fairy-like creatures called trows or trows. I think it's trows, but they, according to legend, they would give birth to children who were sort of sickly, and then when pregnant women would have healthy babies, they'd sort of sneak in the night and switch them out. And those children were known as changelings. So one night they would have their baby, they'd go to sleep, and they'd wake up with this different baby, and they were called changelings. Yeah. So
yeah, I think there's something similar in Irish lore too, where I think they're called the fetch.
The fetch. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But the word doppelganger, I didn't know this, but actually it was introduced by author Jean Paul in a 1796 novel, and it was called, and I'm sure I'm going to get this wrong, but Seibenkas. But basically, the protagonist exchanges identities with his friend and look alike. So that was where the term was first coined.
Oh, okay. Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah. But doppelganger
So it's like a
encounters have,
new idea in
yeah.
the Western world. There's this idea is like kind of newer.
But it is actually kind of, it traces its origins. It's very, very old, even in ancient Egypt.
Oh, right. Okay.
Like the soul was looked at as like a duplicate, there was like the spirit body. But basically, doppelganger encounters have been reported throughout history, and some reports are obviously going to be more verifiable than others. There's even been some scientific study into the phenomenon because,
Really?
yeah, and the term is, I think it's, I don't know how to pronounce this either, but hodoscopy,
Okay.
Heauto. And it's defined as seeing one's own double at a distance. Some scientific theories attempt to demystify it and explain it away as just a purely neurological phenomenon. So it's something that people who are schizophrenic or who are epileptic or have other brain disorders, they can experience this. But just like with any other materialistic theory that just leans completely on that type of explanation, it doesn't explain away mystical causes, especially when the experience is paired with things like premonitions or outside knowledge or
Right.
eyewitnesses. And I'm sure our stories, are going to feature those things.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean that's really interesting. Like, there's right. I mean, there's one thing to sort of have a hallucination out of the corner of your eye, but I think in a number of our stories here, there's like a significant. They're happening at significant moments, and so there's something to that in and of itself, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, they've
Preceding
been,
deaths and things like that being harbingers
right.
of yeah.
They've been viewed differently, depending on the culture and the time. But it's been everything from supernatural entities to spiritual extensions of your own self, or it could even be perceived as like a demonic or ominous representation of the person. Something like kind of like your changeling, which
Right.
is trying to deceive. But it's different from an out of body experience, because people who have near death experiences or have some kind of out of body experience will see their body, but in those cases, the body is just kind of a shell. They've left it; their consciousness has left it, and it's often in some kind of near death situation or during sleep or something like that. So it's very different because a doppelganger, you can actually interact with it potentially. It's a
Oh,
conscious
right. Interesting.
seeming thing.
Right. Cool. So, do you want to get into some stories here about him?
Yes, I do. Do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
Oh, sure. What? Yeah. Why don't you go first?
Okay, awesome. Okay, well, I have three, and I think I'm going to start with one of my favorite doppelganger stories, which seems obvious because I'm a poet and I write poetry, and I particularly love the Romantics. I have a real soft spot for them, and I know we already did an episode and mentioned Keats, but this has to do with Percy Shelley,
Okay. Cool.
the Romantic poet. He actually saw his doppelganger, and he wasn't the only one, as we'll see. So he, just real quickly, Shelley was a contemporary of Byron and Keats and the husband of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. He had a short life, like the other major romantics, that was marred by tragedy and heartbreak. He'd been bullied as a child, and he had a really strong interest, not only in literature and poetry, but also in the sciences. So astronomy, electricity, chemistry, all of these things. And you can kind of see like how Mary Shelley, married to him, they would have had conversations that kind of gave birth to the Frankenstein creature and story. But anyway, I really love this quote about him as a youth that I found on the Poetry Foundation site. It said, "In Shelley's free-ranging mind, there was no contradiction between an interest in science and an appetite for trashy gothic romance thrillers."
Okay.
So I feel like he was kind of a Shadowland sort of guy.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Okay. Just another real quick overview of his, younger life. When he was very young, he eloped with his sweetheart and then abandoned her, and she was found dead later, drowned in a lake and pregnant.
Whoa.
So he had some tragedy very early on, and he had a series of doomed love affairs. Then he married Mary Shelley. There was actually some overlap with him with Mary Shelley and his first wife, which he was, came under a lot of criticism for that. His lifestyle, he was perceived as sort of immoral, but he was a believer in free love.
Huh. And this is like Victorian time. Sorry, maybe you said this already, but when was this?
Pre.
Like what is that, like 15th century, 16th, 17th?
Yeah, 18th century.
Oh, 18th century. Okay.
Yeah. But, and also they lost 3 of their 4 children, he and his
Wow.
wife Mary. So he'd gone through a lot, and he was also a very sensitive person, and, was prone to, what we'd probably call like mood disorders and, anxieties and, kind of these fits. But basically, he and his wife, at one point in time, toward the end of his life, he was about 29 years old, and they went to Italy. They'd been through these tragedies, and loss of their children, and so they decided to go to Italy and get away from everything, be with friends, and one day he was like out on the terrace of his home, in this home that they had rented, and he actually encountered his double. So he's out on the terrace, which overlooks like the ocean with the waves crashing, and he sees himself there and kind of meets this double halfway, and his doppelganger speaks to him and says, "How long do you mean to be content?"
What?
Yeah.
How long do you, what did he say?
How long do you mean to be content?
How long do you mean to be content?
Yes.
Interesting.
So, yeah, it's very interesting. I know it's sort of puzzling. I've thought about like what, I've been trying to kind of work out what exactly that could be coming from. So, given, his mental health issues and his sensitive nature and all of the stuff he's been through and the stress he was under, you might be able to write this off as like a flight of fancy or a stress-induced hallucination. But it was actually corroborated by a friend. Her name was Jane Williams, who was also staying at the house during this time. So this is, after his death, Mary Shelley actually wrote this in a letter. And here's a quote. "Shelley had often seen these figures when ill, but the strangest thing is that Mrs. Williams saw him. Now Jane, though a woman of sensibility, has not much imagination and is not in the slightest degree nervous, neither in dreams or otherwise. She was standing one day, the day before I was taken ill, at a window that looked on the terrace. It was day. She saw that she thought she saw Shelley pass by the window, as he often did, without a coat or a jacket, and then he passed again. Now as he passed both times in the same way, and as from the side toward which he went each time, there was no way to get back except past the window again, except over a wall 20 feet from the ground. She was struck at seeing him pass twice thus, and looked out, and seeing him no more, she cried, 'Good God, can Shelley have leaped from the wall? Where can he be gone?'"
Crazy. So this is at around the same time or the same day that he had this other experience. So she's seeing possibly his double walking around too, or
this is it's in the same time frame.
Same time frame. Okay, and
but at another time though.
But she was also saying something about in that letter that he's had these experiences before, but no one's now other people are seeing it. It's essentially what she's saying in the
Exactly.
beginning.
Yeah,
Okay.
there were multiple times. So there were other times when he was ill, and he, whether that means mental illness or physical illness, I couldn't quite work
I feel like
out.
it was all mixed together back then.
It was kind of, yeah, it was all sort of this
the
part of the same
humors, the
deal.
humors, right?
The humors, yes, it was all about the humors. But basically, he looked up from his bed and he saw his own face kind of like floating above him. So this had happened before, but this is another witness who's seeing it, thinks it's him, and she actually went outside. I know, like, the language is, it's a little kind of hard to work out exactly what's going on there from that quote I read, but basically she saw him pass by a couple times, goes outside after him, and he was nowhere to be found. Now, what's really interesting about this is he wasn't even in the house. He was not home at the time.
Wow.
So she saw him a couple times and no one was there.
Right, right. Like she was seeing a
And
ghost or something like that, right?
yes, exactly. Yeah.
Interesting.
So the thing is, though, as we were talking about doppelgangers being associated with tragedies and impending death, this was shortly before he took a voyage. He basically got into a boat, brought a couple friends, and went sailing one day when a storm was approaching. And it's very sad actually to read about this, because apparently there was a rescue attempt. The waters were churning, the storm was crazy, and things were just going to get worse. And another boat had come along, and someone tried to get Shelley and the people on his boat to leave, and they wouldn't do it. Shelley kind of held them back and said no. So a lot of people have speculated maybe he had a death wish.
Huh.
Yeah. But anyway, he ended up passing away in the storm, and his body washed up on shore like 8 days later or so. And he actually, he was unrecognizable. But the only way that people knew that it was him, he was identified because he had a book of Keats poetry in his pocket.
Whoa.
So he was buried. Yeah, I mean, and this gets like super goth, but he was buried on the beach and exhumed a month later because of local Italian cremation laws. So they actually had to go in, dig up the body, and burn it. And a small group of friends with Mary and Byron and so on were there. And they, basically burned the body until there was nothing left but ashes and some bones. And then strangely, according to, some of the accounts, what they believed to be his heart. And rumor has it that a year or so after Mary Shelley's death, their son Percy Shelley was cleaning out her desk and found a silk bag that was wrapped in some pages of his father's poetry, and it was the heart that had been taken.
Oh, that she had kept?
From the pyre, yeah.
That is pretty goth.
It is. Okay. So that's the Shelley doppelganger story.
Cool.
All right, but I have a couple more.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay. So the next one, maybe you've heard about this, but it's Abraham Lincoln.
Mm-hmm. You're right, yes.
Okay. So, a lot of people don't know this, but Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary, was super interested in the supernatural and paranormal stuff, and she even invited she invited mediums to the White House to hold seances.
Oh, right. I guess I have heard that part, yeah.
Okay. And Lincoln himself was even present, some of the time for these things. Different accounts say that he probably just took all of this stuff with a grain of salt. He thought a lot of the mediums were fakers, but he did have some belief in the paranormal, particularly in predictive dreams. And he'd had a few dreams that, he shared with people, and he really seemed to believe that, there was something that could be, taken away from some certain dreams. And he actually had a dream that foretold his own death at one point, which maybe we can do for the dream episode.
Right, right.
Okay, so here's the doppelganger story. Shortly after he was elected in 1860, this happened. And this is a direct quote that's taken from a biography by Noah Brooks, who claims that he heard it from the president himself directly after he was reelected. So here's a quote supposedly from Lincoln. It was just after my election in 1860 when the news had been coming in thick and fast all day, and there had been a great hurrah, boys, so that I was well tired out, and I went home to rest, throwing myself down on a lounge in my chamber. Opposite where I lay was a bureau with a swinging glass upon it. And then Brooks says, and here he got up and placed furniture to illustrate the position. So Lincoln kind of just showed him the arrangement. But anyway, there was this bureau that had a mirror. So then Lincoln said...
that's what the swinging glass is.
The swinging glass is a mirror. Right, yeah. So there's like a big bureau with a I think, a full-length mirror. So he said, looking in that glass, I saw myself reflected nearly at full length. But my face, I noticed, had two separate and distinct images. The tip of the nose of one being about 3 inches from the tip of the other. So he saw 2 images of his own face in the mirror. And then he said, I was a little bothered, perhaps startled, and got up and looked in the glass, but the illusion vanished. So when he stood up, he couldn't see the second face anymore. On lying down again, I saw it a second time, plainer, if possible, than before. And then I noticed that one of the faces was a little paler, about 5 shades, than the other. I got up and the thing melted away, and I went off, and in the excitement of the hour forgot all about it, nearly, but not quite, for the thing would once in a while come up and give me a little pang as if something uncomfortable had happened. So it was something that was bothering him. It was this unusual event, and, he obviously just had been elected, had a lot going on, but couldn't quite shake this feeling of unease. And then he said, when I went home again that night, I told my wife about it, and a few days afterward, I made the same experiment again when, sure enough, the thing came back again, but I never succeeded in bringing the ghost back after that. So he's calling it a ghost, and he tried this experiment multiple times. And then he said, though I once tried very industriously to show it to my wife, who was somewhat worried about it. She thought that it was a sign that I was to be elected to a second term of office, and that the paleness of one of the faces was an omen that I should not see life through the last term. So in other words, his wife thought that this meant that he would die in his second term. And indeed, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth on April 14th, 1865, 3 months into his second term as president.
That's crazy. Yeah, because it's supposed to be that type of event. It's supposed to be some type of harbinger or whatever of death, right?
Right, right.
And that's interesting that she kind of like called it out specifically. And I mean, just having that experience, I think, it's like one thing to sort of see as something out of the corner of your eye, but to then see it and then see it again and then try to see it again and it's there and just like the pale thing, it's just, yeah, it's a very strange.
Right. So yeah, I thought it was interesting also that he tried to duplicate it. It was almost like he was performing an experiment.
Right, right.
But he was unable to do it. So it appeared a certain number of times and then he couldn't get it to happen again. So that kind of like, eliminates, the possibility that it was something like some sort of reflection or,
Mm-hmm. Right, right.
Okay.
Cool.
So you ready for one more?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So my last one is another poet. It is the English metaphysical poet John Donne, who reported seeing a doppelganger of his wife who was pregnant at the time. And this was in 1612, so even earlier than Shelley.
Okay.
Okay. So in 1612, 2 days after Donne had arrived in Paris from London, Donne and some of his friends had all had dinner together in the place that they were staying. And his wife hadn't made the journey with him, so she was not there. So he had no way of contacting her. This is 1612. Obviously, no
Pre
phones,
iPhone.
pre-phone, yeah, pre-iPhone, pre a lot of shit. So after dinner, everyone left the room, and Dunn was by himself for about a half an hour. And then 30 minutes or so later, a friend of his named Sir Robert came back into the room and found Dunn looking extremely agitated and shaken up. And since it had only been half an hour, his friend was really perplexed and, couldn't imagine what could have happened. He's in this room for just 30 minutes by himself. Why was he so upset? And so he asked him what happened. And at first, Dunn was so upset that he couldn't even speak. But eventually, when he could, he said this: "I have seen a dreadful vision since I saw you. I have seen my dear wife pass twice by me through this room, with her hair hanging about her shoulders and a dead child in her arms. This I have seen since I saw you." So while he was by himself in the room, he saw a vision of his wife walk by him with her hair hanging about her shoulders, which back then you would imagine the hair was up a lot, and she's holding a dead child in her arms.
That'll fuck you over there.
Yeah, yeah. To which Sir Robert replied, "Sir, you have slept since I saw you, and this is the result of some melancholy dream, which I desire you to forget, for you are now awake." So he's telling him, you must have fallen asleep and, thought you saw this, but it was just a dream. And Dunn's reply was, "I cannot be sure that I now live, than that I have not slept since I saw you, and am as sure that at her second appearing she stopped, looked me in the face, and vanished." Okay, so there's a little bit of disagreement over the specific dates that this happened and when he was there and so forth. But in fact, Dunn's wife had miscarried their daughter, and he had no way of knowing this except for the vision.
That's crazy. I mean, I feel like that's definitely possible to have premonitions and stuff through dreams. I mean, that doesn't really seem that, doppelganger aside, like that far-fetched, right? Like,
yeah, to me it almost seems like
it kind of experiences of this stuff.
Right. Well, the line is blurred too. It's kind of like, is it a doppelganger, or is it some kind of like there's an extreme emotion taking place in a crisis?
Right.
And just like when people claim to see loved ones, at the moment of their passing, like, could, the extreme emotions of that event have allowed her to somehow communicate with them?
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting question. We should definitely get into some of that on like a dreams episode. I think that would be a cool topic.
I think we've got one planned.
Yes. Cool. All right, those are great. Cool. Okay, so I have two.
Okay.
So I feel like we got a lot of like poets and writers in here. I don't know if there's a correlation there, but with doppelgangers. But the first one here is about Goethe. So I imagine most listeners know who Goethe is, but if you don't, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe was a poet and playwright, best known for his play Faust, which he wrote, I think, with somebody else. But anyways, when he was 22, he was riding along a road, heading home from spending time with his lover Frederica. I think that's how you say it. And so as he's riding along this road, he all of a sudden passes a figure that looks exactly like him, wearing clothes that he had never seen before. There was something like different about the type of clothes, and not just seeing himself, but it's like a strange image of this figure passing him. And this is what he said in his own words: "I saw not with the eyes of the body, but with those of the mind, my own figure coming towards me on horseback, on the same road, attired in a suit which I had never worn." He said this in his autobiography. "As soon as I shook myself out of this dream, the figure had entirely disappeared." So I think this is an interesting one that, he sort of said he saw this not with the eyes of the body, but with the mind. Like he saw it was like kind of a vision. His experience of it was that it was some sort of vision, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, he never forgets the encounter, but as time progresses, he sort of slips to the back of his mind. until one day, 8 years later, by freak chance, he finds himself riding along the same road back the other way to see his lover wearing the exact same clothing that he had seen his doppelganger wore years prior.
Now that's interesting. That's like a time slip.
Yes. So and that's exactly how he interpreted it, that he was able to catch a glimpse of himself in the future rather than it being, sort of bad omen. But yeah, that was his story, which is very interesting, right? Like I think he had, talked about having this experience, and it had this sort of indelible impression on him, but he was still able to sort of forget about it enough until the moment where it actually happened. So yeah, that's Goethe's doppelganger story.
Well, it's super interesting. I've never heard that one before.
Yeah, I feel like I had heard something about it, but yeah, this whole notion that and is this kind of with this? It was this figure in his life, Frederica. She was this lover of his, and they had this like sort of short but intense relationship, and I don't think he ended up marrying her, but it was all kind of tied up in this this sort of love affair and in these sort of key moments. I think the one when he was actually originally had gone to see her the first time, he had told her he wasn't marrying her, and then he was going to see her like 8 years later. I don't know if he was married at that time or not, but it was kind of this sort of pivotal moment, I think, in his life. So I think there was something interesting about that.
Oh, so both times it was associated with this woman.
Yes.
This specific person.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Which makes you kind of wonder, like, does it have to do with the emotions that he had?
Yeah, right.
Does it have to do with the person, where somehow the two of them together had created some kind of openness?
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, back to what you were saying about the dreams, like maybe there's some type of like, there's an emotional pitch to events that maybe let us feel them off in the future and in the past or across great distances that, especially when we have a sort of intimate relationship with somebody. I'm sure everyone's had that experience of like picking up the phone. I mean, well, this is back when there was like, phones that you would dial, road or whatever. But like, picking up the phone and the person, I've called my friends as a kid, and I had a best friend that would pick up sometimes before the phone rang to call me. You know what I mean? Everyone's had that type of,
Right.
being in sync with someone in a certain way.
I actually, yeah, with my best friend, I have an interesting kind of thing. It was a dream, though.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I dreamed that she told me she was pregnant, and a few days later, she told me she was pregnant.
Oh, really? Wow. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like that. Like, I think, it's not that hard of a thing to wrap your head around. It's just, it is hard to explain in sort of scientific terms, but I imagine that, it being a common experience, and, maybe it's just that we're not really advanced in our understanding enough of, the brain and time and what the mind really is. I think the mind sort of maybe a lot bigger than we think, and maybe what we sort of perceive as reality is a little bit more porous and malleable than we think, but, yeah. Cool. Okay. So I have one more here. And this is one that like, it's kind of gone around quite a bit. I think this is probably one of the more, classic examples, classic stories that I think it's almost at this point sort of reached the level of like urban legend. But it is the story of the double of Emily Sagi. So in 1845, Emily, then 32, took a job as a teacher working at a French language girls' school in Latvia. So she was apparently very talented and well-liked there. I think she was fairly beloved. But at some point, these rumors started going around about her. And one day in class, as she wrote on the blackboard, a second apparition of her appeared beside her, mimicking her movements, but without the chalk in her hand. So it was like this double doing exactly what she was doing, but it wasn't, writing on the chalkboard with a piece of chalk. And then the vision disappeared. Another evening, Sagi was eating in the dining hall, and the double appeared again, again mirroring her actions, and then again sort of disappearing. And apparently these were all like being witnessed by many children in the school. There were further sightings. I think some of them started to get sort of more and more scary. A lot of rumors around it. And then on another occasion, Saji's double sat down in a chair at the head of the classroom, staring straight toward the children, while the real teacher was actually out in the school garden doing gardening. So this is one where like they were like in totally different places. So while she never apparently saw her double, it was only other people that saw it. It's reported that when the entity was present, the color would, and this is a quote from someone, the color would drain from her face, become overcome with fatigue, and her movements would become listless, as if she were in some sort of weird state of mind while this happened.
So almost as if it were taxing her.
Yeah, as if it were taxing her. And eventually the school let her go, and so ended the story. So this story is like quite a bit, all over the internet and in different stories, different books and things like that. I did read one article where I think someone tried to like really trace it back, and they found it like traced back to basically one telling of it a long time ago. So I think there's some thought that this, came from maybe someone's, maybe it was more like an urban legend or something, but it is interesting that it's the one that's sort of been repeated. It's almost become, sort of indelible in the, doppelganger story world as sort of like this very classic one. But yeah, that is the story of Emily Saji.
That's really cool. I mean, I've heard the story before. I've never heard the part about her, getting pale and kind of like showing some signs of, being, it almost sounds like she's being drained or something. Like her life force is sort of split or something like that.
Right. Or that she had, that she couldn't see this thing, which is different than all the other doppelganger stories, right? Like all of them have something to do with the person it's about seeing somebody, but this one was, she wasn't able to, see it directly.
Right. But it seems like there were a lot of witnesses.
Yes.
Compared to these other stories that we have.
Yep. Yeah. It's interesting.
Really cool. I mean, it's really spooky. What do you think they are?
I don't know. I mean, I think this is another one of those phenomena that's like, it's grouping together a lot of things, a lot of different phenomena. Like I think, having a dream with, a premonition in it is sort of could be sometimes what's happening. I think, like the Lincoln one's really interesting because of the sort of ghostly quality of it and the timing of it. And then his wife's interpretation of it is very strange, right?
And his doppelganger was also pale looking. Yeah.
Yes, right.
Well, I mean, you also have to wonder, like, if a lot of these things are happening right before someone dies, is there, something happening where maybe the person, where the veil is kind of permeable for them,
Yeah, right.
Where maybe there's like, if there is sort of an appointed time for us to go, that, and you hear about this with people who are having near-death experiences and who are dying in the hospital and so forth, where they reach a stage where they start seeing dead relatives and friends, and they're able to see things that the rest of the people around them cannot. But is this something that also could occur with someone who's going to die, even if they're not aware of it, if they're not sick?
Yeah, right. I mean, is this some sort of like echo that they're seeing, right? In a highly sensitive moment, right? Like, in Goethe's, case, seeing this vision of the future of himself in this highly sensitive moment.
That, to me, exactly. That feels a little bit more like there was something really resonant, and like it was some kind of a time slip thing that happened, and it had something to do with this particular woman.
Right. And then, he saw this, again, in his words, not with the eyes of the body, with those of his mind. So it's like he was sort of seeing into his own future, you know what I mean? And sort of seeing it sort of transposed into that moment. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's almost like the intensity of his emotions and maybe the focus, like when you're
right.
super focused on a person or a subject or whatever it is, maybe that kind of enabled him to tap into like an ESP moment.
Yeah. And like, I mean, so, I only researched this so deeply, but like I read a few different versions.
You're not
of
a doppelganger expert?
No. Nor an expert about Goethe, but there was one telling of that he was actually going to tell Frederica that he was not going to marry her. And apparently they had this very intense love affair, and he realized he wasn't ready or wasn't going to do it. And, it was this very upsetting, emotional moment in his life, probably one that he thought about for the rest of his life. Right. And then this is after that happened. He's like riding home. So he's in this very emotional state. And then he sees himself 8 years later, in some, visual form of deja vu in a way. Right. Like it's really interesting. And there's
that's really interesting to me too. Like just like the whole, people talk about soulmates and in a very sentimental way, but there are spiritual connections between people, I believe, and I think that would be really interesting to do that one in another episode.
Yeah, and then there's this idea of bilocation. That's another explanation that's sometimes wrapped into this whole phenomena that's sort of called doppelganger, which is where people are able to someone's able to appear somewhere else when they're somewhere, right? Like either consciously or unconsciously. I just remember reading in Paramahansa's Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi. He talks about this yogi that was known for doing that, right? That he would appear in multiple places at once, and there's actually a story in there about him going to visit someone going to visit this yogi, and meeting him along the road to go see him, and then once he gets there, the yogi's waiting there for him, meditating, and had never left. So there's stories about that throughout, I think sort of spiritual history of people who are able to sort of like appear in other places.
Right. Well, I mean, you even see that in the New Testament of the Bible with Jesus appearing to people like after the resurrection.
Yeah, Carlos Castaneda in the Teachings of Don Juan actually talks about Don Juan actually goes into the whole thing about like actually being able to appear different places, and there's even stories in there about that. So it's definitely a phenomena that has some, that's been told in a lot of different contexts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you can understand why it would be scary and why people could look at it as an ominous sign. There is just something about the idea of looking at your own mirror image. I don't know if you've ever done this before, but when you look into a mirror, there's, I don't know what it is. It feels like there's almost something kind of primal, that you can tap into fear-wise. Like, and I don't know if it's, like, what if you're not seeing yourself and you're seeing something else? What if there's something in the background? Maybe it's like some primal thing, like there could be a predator behind you, and but it, there's definitely something to that. The idea of like a reflection or reflected self that inspires fear in certain ways, or unease, or something spiritual.
Yeah, I mean, there's some cultures that don't even like their image being reflected or captured in portraiture, or that there's something sort of taken of the spirit in that. But yeah, you're seeing this, this image of the world, but it's actually the flipped, right? Like what we see of ourselves is actually not even what people see. People actually see the mirror image of what we see, Right. Like if you have you looked in those like
Oh my
mirrors that
God.
reflect
Yes.
mirrors?
In the Lower East Side, there was a restaurant bar. I don't remember. Was it called something pony? The pink pony, the white pony. I don't remember. It was in the lower. It was a restaurant bar on the Lower East Side. And I remember they had one of those weird mirrors that it wasn't a mirror image. It wasn't flipped, and it looked
like two
so
mirrors, right?
strange.
Yeah,
it looked so strange because
Right,
you're actually seeing what you look like.
Yeah, like our experience. The same thing with our voice. Like most people hate their voice because what we hear is like resonated inside our skulls. So we actually like the image we have of ourselves and how we sound is like literally not what other people see and hear, which is like kind of crazy, right? So,
right.
Anyway,
Well,
cool. All right. Well, that was good. How do you feel about that?
I feel pretty good. I
Yeah,
feel pretty good. I think we covered doppelgangers.
Yep.
And, there's certainly room to do more later on, but
Sure.
Yeah, so if anybody out there has actually had a doppelganger experience, we would just love to hear about it. And you can write us at shadowlandpodcast@gmail.com.
Yep. And we got a bunch of new cool stuff coming up. Lots of new.
Yes, definitely. And for
shadowy
February, we
topics.
have some Valentine's Day themed things.
That's
We won't
right.
give it away now, but
Yep.
you'll definitely want to listen.
Yep. Yeah, maybe we'll start teasing some of our episodes so you guys know what's coming up, and if you have like stories or anything like that you want to add to them,
Right. I'm not saying there's alien
weigh in
sex,
on
but there might be alien sex.
There might be. Definitely might be. Cool. All right.
Okay.
So I feel pretty good.
I do too.
All right. So I guess until next time.
All right. I'll talk to you later.
Okay. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Shadowland Podcast is produced by Seth Jablon and Christina Callaghan. Edited by Tim Kelly. Theme music by Tim Lincoln.
Thanks, Tim.